I want to say that I am truly honored to be moderating this panel since the inception of the Planet MicroCap showcase 9 years ago. I have to say this conference has really taken off. When we first started, we had companies that were just okay. The list of companies here, Shelly, Bobby, and Lulu, are really unbelievable. And I want to thank you guys for helping put me on the map with all the business that I've been fortunate enough to attain since being here. So again, I'm Neil Levine. I'm an assurance partner at Markham LLP. I've been serving the capital markets since 1998. Joe Lukoski, pay attention. I want to say that today we'll be discussing keeping up with the rules changes and regulations affecting the microcaps and what public companies are facing in 2023. So you may recognize me as the former chair of the SEC practice at Friedman LLP since 2010. 8 months ago, we did do a merger with Markham LLP, which puts us at the number 5 in the world, really, handling public companies, which I'm very proud of. Today, we are the 12th largest accounting firm with over $1.1 billion of revenue. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, some who I've worked with over the last 10 years. I've got Corey Fischer, who I've worked with for probably 20 years, managing partner of Weinberg and Company, a PCAOB registered firm. I've got Neil Reithinger, president of Eventus Advisory Group, a CFO services provider, and we affectionately call Neil Reithinger, but he'll have to live with that. And then we have Stephen Kreit, managing partner of Kreit and Chiu. Steve is a newbie to our panel, but he is a registered PCAOB firm. So at this point, I'm going to throw it to Corey and the rest of my panelists to just tell them a little bit about themselves and the services they provide. Corey.
Thank you, Neil. It's great to be here again. I don't know, since inception we've been doing this panel. Thank you, Neil, and to the Crafts. Our firm, Weinberg and Company, we're based in Los Angeles. The firm focuses just pretty much on audits of small cap public companies. Been doing it a long time. We have anywhere from 40 to 50 public companies that are about to emerge in the public markets, doing some sort of financial transaction. We have offices mostly in Los Angeles, but we cover internationally. We've probably, I would say, good 25% of our clients are international or outside of the U.S.
Thanks, Corey. Good to be here with you again. Thanks, Neil and the Crafts. Eventus Advisory Group is a CFO services firm. We are specialize in accounting and financial operations, SEC compliance, and FP&A and CFO services. And advisory, we also have a internal control and SOX advisory practice. Our clients are both public and private. We have been around since about 2008, and our staff is also across the U.S., and they're specialized in each of the areas of our verticals so that we have deep specialty within each one of those categories. So we work well with auditors like these two gentlemen to my left and right because we are on the non-attest side. Okay, so we're embedded with the client. We like to work seamlessly with our clients in order to be an extension of their team. Okay, glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Stephen Kreit. I'm the managing partner at Kreit and Chiu. We're a fairly new firm. Our 2-year anniversary is actually this coming up Monday. We have grown in a short period of time from 4 people to now 35 people worldwide. We focus on audits. 90% of what we do is audit work, and 90% of that 90% is PCAOB audit work. We work with small cap, micro cap, mid cap companies. Half our business, half the companies we work with are international. So we have clients in China and India and Singapore and Indonesia and Hong Kong, all of which trade here or want to trade here in the U.S. And then the other half of the business is U.S.-based companies. That's it. Thank you.
Great. So let's start off the conference with something near and dear to my heart. Corey, why has the PCAOB made life so difficult for the auditors and the companies that we handle?
Neil, that's a interesting question. There really hasn't been much that have changed in the PCAOB standards over the last few years, other than the change in the audit report, which now requires the identification of a critical audit matter. But what seems to have changed is the perception of the PCAOB. There's been a change in administration, change at the top of the PCAOB, and they seem to be very enforcement-oriented. If you look at the scope of PCAOB inspection reports over the past couple of years, certainly the number of comments have increased. And because of that, the auditors have gotten much more diligent in what they're doing. Just show of hands, how many people here were actually involved in an audit this year? Was anybody here actually a CFO or involved other than Drew? Well, from the practitioners I've spoken with and the other clients that I've talked to, companies I've talked to, this is a particularly difficult year for audits. The number of late filers certainly dramatically increased, and I think a lot of it really had to go back to a lot of issues that related to judgmental issues such as impairment and, for instance, goodwill and intangibles that were put on the books a couple years ago, inventories where companies stocked up because the supply chain problems in the prior years, so they bought additional inventory, but that inventory hasn't moved. How do you adjust it? So there were a lot of subjective issues this year, and it caused a lot of conflicts and difficulties in doing the audits. The PCAOB, again, really hasn't changed anything. Again, the critical audit matters is new, where auditors are supposed to identify areas that are subject to very judgmental, subjective areas. It's interesting to note in the collapse of Silicon Valley, KPMG was the auditor, and they did not address the issue in their critical audit matters of why that bank failed, which had to do with the unrealized losses. And I'm not a banking guy, but if they had put that in their audit report, would that have changed what happened, the collapse? Probably not. But anyway, there's the issue of the PCAOB. The pressure on the CPA firms is definitely being pushed down to the clients because of the increased scrutiny that we have to give, especially in these judgmental areas.
Okay, thank you, Corey. So I want to tell a little story. I'm not a real technical guy, and I took my firm through PCAOB inspection in 2009. And Michael Cohen over there will tell you we got no comments. But when the guy came in, he goes, Levine, you're a mess here. And he started to leave. I put my arm around him, and I said, please, Mr. Feldman, stay here. And we got through it. So with that, I'm going to ask Stephen, who just went through his PCAOB inspection last week. Just tell us a little bit about what you've noticed being, you said you have 35 people. How did it go for you guys?
Sure. So, yeah, we just finished it. We actually had our status call this morning, so it went into overtime. And it was certainly an interesting process. It was our firm's first PCAOB review. I've been an audit partner for a number of years, so I have gone through some personally as an engagement partner, but never at representing the firm and holding the firm's inspection kind of responsibility for that. So I just want to touch on a couple of areas that they focused on that's going to affect the issuers as much as it's going to affect the auditors. So one example is just the level of detail with which they looked at work papers and asked questions. As an example, we, one of our clients did goodwill impairment. They put together a cash flow projection. The client based some of the estimates on industry reports and on industry reports that were put out by brokerage houses. And the PCAOB's question for us is why did the company choose one expert report one investment report over another firm's investment report? And why were these assumptions better than those assumptions? Where in the past, you have a third party that gives a report like that. That's something that they had focused on less previously. Internal controls, they focused on the level of review and the rigor of that review by the companies. What did they actually do? Who did they ask questions of? What did they tie things into? Obviously they wanted the auditors to make sure we audited those those as well, but they were really concerned about the company's process and what they did to analyze and make these estimates, and their internal controls as well. Another area where they focused on was using the work of others, using experts. So valuation firms. A lot of companies that are going through audits need to use valuation firms for different aspects of their audit. They focused a lot on what the valuation firm did themselves. Not only their report, they actually got the valuation expert on the phone so they could ask them some questions about some of the assumptions and some of the things that they did. So, like I said, it was certainly a little bit more detailed than I thought, the level that they looked at, the level of the questions that they asked. Like Corey said earlier, that all trickles down to our clients and the work that we do for them.
Yeah, so Steve, one question. What did you think about the quality of the inspectors? I mean, I think like in the old days, if you went to work for a government agency, I don't know if you were a sharp, I don't know if there's a bias here, but did you think, tell me about the quality.
So we were, I guess we were lucky in a way. We had some very experienced inspectors, one of which I actually had worked with. She inspected one of my jobs when I was at Eisner, one of the large pharmaceutical companies I worked on, so I had known her in the past. But for the most part, other than maybe one person, they were all, 15 plus years experienced. They understood obviously we have to follow the rules. There's a lot of rigor in all the PCAOB guidance, and they point to those rules constantly. But at the same time, they did understand that how audits work, how they go on, how things are documented. They were very fair. I would say overall they were very fair. They were experienced, and you probably won't hear a lot of accounting firms say this, but the experience was okay. The experience was okay. I'll tell you again in a year when my report comes out, though.
Yeah, so thanks so much. So Neil, as a third-party consultant that's not independent, where do you see the best practices essential to support a company's reporting process, getting them ready for a possible inspection and their interaction with the auditors? And I just want to thank your firm for getting us through a few Ks this time around through March, but what do you think?
Yep, always great to work with your team. What jumps out a lot too is really leadership in terms of the audit process, and that you have to be proactive and not reactive to what has to be done. You have to obviously have good financial processes in place, timely monthly close. You have to make sure that all the reconciliations are done. That's all table stakes, right? But you also have to go in and plan for what are the material items. What are the major areas that are very technical that need to be ironed out ahead of time, write memos for, and actually understand the underlying accounting so that those can be planned for in the audit, and it doesn't become, again, like a reactive process or happens too late in the process so that you're dealing with it and all of a sudden you may be potentially late on the engagement. So I think a lot of that has to do with planning and the leadership aspect. Another thing is, you got to communicate with the auditor that the timing, of readiness. You can't say, okay, I'm ready to go and nothing's ready. They put a team in place. They want to make sure they can start and not stop. Pick the pen up, put the pen down. They don't want to have to. They want to be efficient. So the preparatory work is very important. Yes, you're going to get a PBC list prepared by client list, but you have to have a lot of that really ready to be delivered to the auditors so that they can have an efficient audit process and that it can run smoothly and on time. Financial statement preparation, they don't need that right out of the gate. But as far as footnotes and financials, but they need to have that need to start in parallel so that midway through as they're doing field work, you can deliver that as well on a timely basis, and they're not waiting for that, and with all issues addressed because you've already addressed the major items ahead of time. And then a big area too is controls and procedures, because you can have. I think there is there's an increasing level of scrutiny with respect to the role all the constituents play, the issuer, if they're using outside consultants and what have you, in their review of their financial statements, so that when they are delivered to the auditor, they are accurate and they're free of any misstatements. And because the material weakness aspect is a very big area, and that can quickly happen if all of those stakeholders are not invested in the process and reviewing the financials, right? So even though there may be someone outside of the company, they have to be, a consultant, for example, has to be prepared to look at those financials as their own as well and make sure that they can, have all those financials delivered, free of material misstatement. And of course, lastly is it's part of the leadership is just implement a schedule. Put a schedule in place. Here's the due date. Here's the deliverables that have to be backed in to hit that date, and just work backward from there to file even early. So that you know what everybody has to do. There's only 45 days for Q, right? So I mean, it's not a lot of time that's going to take to get that done. So you have to really be very vigilant about planning and doing that, and having bi-weekly meetings if necessary to make sure that people stay on point. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Neil. So Corey, last time we did this panel, ESG, environmental, social, what's the other word? Governance criteria. I let you talk about it last time. What happened this K season, and has this been implemented yet, and what do you see?
Actually, I've got the exact same notes from
Oh,
last
good.
year.
Because I gave you the same question.
Because the SEC, well, the answer is nothing yet has changed from last year. ESG disclosures, it's a process of communicating companies' environmental, social, and governance policies to its shareholders and its stakeholders. The S component, the social, the G component, the governance, pretty much a lot of those rules have already been adopted and incorporated into the SEC disclosures, either compensation tables expanded from what they were before, or through some of the NASDAQ rules or exchange listing rules as far as diversity and these types of disclosures. But what hasn't been adopted yet was the environmental, which is coming out of the SEC, their guidance, and the proposed guidance was released in 2023 of March, so we did talk about it at last year's conference. Has not yet been adopted. It's supposed to be, they were supposed to come out with their final draft in April, which I don't believe has come out, and it's probably not gonna come out for a while. And it really relates to climate change and again, sort of a politically driven component. The SEC believes that there are threats to companies from global warming, and they fall into two categories: physical risks to a company's operations and facilities by extreme weather, and transition risks relating from efforts to reduce the use of fossil fuel and preparing for climate change. So the proposal, the SEC rule, the major effect that's going to have on companies is that, number one, companies are going to have to disclose their direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions, which they refer to as Scope 1 or Scope 2 emissions, as well as disclosing supplier and partner emissions, which would be Scope 3. And what's really going to be interesting is the Scope 1 and Scope 2 are going to have to be verified. Scope 3 right now, they say, would not have to be verified. The second thing that are going to come into the company's disclosures would be the actual or likely material impacts of climate change and that the risk might have on a business. So these rules are just proposed. They haven't come into play yet, but they are coming. And what's interesting is that these rules are going to affect really not only public companies, but also private companies, because number one, if you're going to do business internationally, their disclosure requirements as far as the Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 are pretty much there already. And so if you're going to ship something to somebody in the UK, you're probably going to have the carbon emissions verified. And if you're a private company here in the US selling to a US public company, you're going to need to provide them with the carbon emission data on the products that you sell because they have to disclose it. So it's very wide ranging, has not yet been approved, and we'll have to see where it goes.
Thanks, Corey. Stephen. So we would be remiss if we didn't speak about the SPAC market, SEC regs regarding SPACs, the failure of SPACs. I mean, IPOs, reverse mergers, and then there were SPACs. So I know Markham, we audited 346 SPACs last year, and I invested in like 6 or 7 different SPACs that we didn't audit that have completely failed, like Beachbody and such and such. So tell us what's going on in the SPAC market.
Sure. So, you know, you mentioned reverse mergers, and you know, the SEC has never been a fan of SPACs. They've never been a fan of reverse mergers. They've really never been a fan of any other way going public other than a traditional IPO, because that's really, they feel the investors are not protected really through any other mechanism. And the PCAOB decided to throw their hat in the ring and declare how much they don't like SPACs either. Just this month, they put out an inspection observation that talks about the audit firms and the audits of SPACs. Some interesting statistics. For the 2021 audits, and if you remember, that was when the warrant issue around SPACs kind of exploded on the scene. But 94% of the SPAC audits that they inspected had audit failures, and 43% of de-SPAC transactions and audits had audit failures. It did improve in 22. In 22, only a third of SPAC audits had audit deficiencies, so significantly better, but I would still say pretty lousy. And for de-SPACs, it really only drops slightly from 43% failure rate to a 38% failure rate. So what are the areas that they focused on? De-SPAC transactions was one of the key areas that they, how that was accounted for. Valuations and the lack of evidence and the lack of audit work around it. Equity and debt restructuring, going concern, internal control over financial reporting deficiencies. They specifically noted that management's lack of financial reporting experience should be considered very significantly in whether or not the SPAC has a material weakness and whether or not that should be reported. So like I said, the SEC has always tried with comment letters and other ways, the warrant issue I just mentioned, to slow down the process and to discourage these ways to go public. The PCAOB, by putting pressure on auditors and by talking about the audit failures, is really doing the same thing, just coming in a different direction. Essentially what this means is as the SPAC market continues, there's going to be more time that's going to be needed to be invested by companies or by SPACs working with Neil and Eventus and other providers. And there's going to be more audit time that's going to be involved. There's going to be more work involved. And that, as like I mentioned with the PCAOB inspection and some of the things that they brought up, that adds time and adds fees. So that's, I think that's where we are right now with the SPAC market.
Thanks. So you mentioned the term de-SPAC. You may just want to
sure.
elaborate what that transaction is.
Sorry, being the accountant, I forget that stuff. So de-SPAC is essentially when the SPAC acquires a private company that reverse merges into it, and that takes that private company public. That is known as a de-SPAC transaction.
Great, thank you. So Neil, since this is a MicroCap conference, we got to talk about a little MicroCap. Best practices for your late filers, if you had any, and we can even elaborate and go into the new regs on the OTC market. I've heard this term expert market. So you had the OTC QB and the QX and pink sheets, and now you have something called expert. I don't know if anybody on the panel wants to talk about that today.
Sure. Well, first of all, in late filings, it gets back to what I mentioned before as well. And how do you correct that? I mean, nobody wants to see that, right? So, you have to do these postmortems after a filing and say, even when things go well, and say what went well, what went wrong, how do we correct that in the future? How do we, even if it went well, how do we improve process in the future? and look at where the deficiencies are in the financial close process, whatever that might be. Look at valuation issues. There's a lot going on with fair value in terms of being and understanding everything has to be fair valued, right? So just be prepared. That's a preparatory aspect with every audit. Was there any inability to provide SEC compliant financials for the auditor, and what got held up on that? Again, getting back to the leadership aspect of this, right? So, and sticking with these vigilant timelines and these deadlines and having a plan. So we had a lot of companies that, back to your second point, that were, September 28th, the SEC's amendments to Rule 15C211 came down, and basically the final hammer hit on March 28th, where these companies that were considered still shells were delisted, right? And prior to that, companies had been delisted as well because they either didn't have timely reports, but ultimately the final hammer came down for those that really were still reporting that were still a shell, right? And they went down to what's called the expert markets, and really what that is, it's really the old gray sheets, and what happens is you lose your 211, which is your ability to electronically trade affects liquidity significantly, and in that regard, it could be viewed that essentially that was a final hammer, and maybe that was no ability to actually trade again unless you filed a new 211, which is very, it takes time. And one of the biggest areas is a regression analysis for the shares. You have to actually get the genealogy of all the shares that were issued, original issuances, and who bought them when, what did they pay, who were the buyers, and admittedly some of that is weeding out bad actors and so on. And it's actually, despite the fact that it isn't something part of getting a 211. This is part of the 211 process in general, even for a new issuer, right? So in doing that, a lot of these companies couldn't do that. Think about a shell that's been around for 25 years, and they don't even know where all their it's almost impossible to do that. And a lot of companies, unfortunately, are not going to be able to do that, right? So the strongest survived, and those that could not do that may potentially still exist on the expert markets, but liquidity will be hampered, right, significantly because they don't have that. But I think what's emerged from that is the importance is that everybody's looking at cap tables, right? Like OTC markets, when you see their disclosures, they want to know more and more about who owns what stock, where the shares are at. They don't want to see that something's in an LLC without identifying the person. They want to know what they paid. They want to understand the dilution on convertible securities. It's just like NASDAQ's been doing for years. When you file a listing of additional shares form, they want to know where the shares are at so people don't get blindsided, assuming they read the reports, with dilution that's out there. So I think it's all a matter of a focus on, and that's good for the markets, I believe, in terms of clean cap tables. And even if there are transactions that have derivative securities, at least everybody sees it and it's fully disclosed, right? So I think that the market now with this is, unfortunately, a lot of companies did get delisted, but those that are stronger and those that liquidity would be for those that are fully reporting or that have transparency of their financials in the marketplace, which is the way it always should have been, right? So.
Yeah, so there are also these, and I know because I hold some, the limited financial disclosure companies that are on the pink. They're impossible to deposit. I know we have a lot of investors out here. So do you think that's going to be the next step, that they took out the shells and now they're going to go maybe to the limited companies that only give limited financial information?
I don't think so. I think that basically, the OTC markets has their own standard with the alternative reporting standards, and in that regard, the audits are not required, the reviews are not required. So, but you got to continually demonstrate your ability to timely file. Okay. So if you're an SEC registrant, you're obviously going to continue to report to the SEC, but hopefully not. And because I think that as long as, just because, if you're filing and even though the audit isn't there, that's okay as long as you are providing GAAP compliant and, in a way, SEC compliant financials, that basically is, I think, the disclosure requirement they're looking for. Okay.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
So Corey, I'm going to pass you this time because I want to lighten this up a little bit. So Stephen, talk about working from home, what the pandemic did, what has the shortage of accountants meant to companies, and just what's going on in our industry as it affects our client acceptance because of the shortages that we may have. Go ahead.
Sure. So there's the big things that are in the news, firms merging. Markham and Friedman come to mind as one that did that. There are other issues with the PCAOB coming down much harder on firms and individual partners, shutting down firms, not letting partners practice in front of the PCAOB or SEC. So there's some pressure from that regard that absolutely trickles down to companies and issuers, or companies that are trying to be issuers, and getting the firms to focus on them and getting the work done. Another big issue around that is staffing. There is absolutely a staff shortage of auditors, and it's not getting any better. So I'm an alumni of University of Buffalo on the East Coast, Buffalo, New York. I'm part of the School of Management Advisory Committee, and every year they've been showing us how students that are enrolled in the accounting program have declined every year for the last 12 to 15 years. In an article I read about the University of Texas, the gentleman who runs the accounting program there said that accounting majors dropped between 20 and 40% just in the last 4 or 5 years. In addition to that, due to retirements and accountants aging out and all kinds of growth and other things like that, there'll be at a minimum of 135,000 job openings for accountants every year for the next 10 years. Doesn't sound like a great combination of things. That obviously puts a pressure on salaries and what people and accountants earn. It's also, which obviously then trickles down to companies and to clients, because the fees have to go up. And in addition, as I'm sure a lot of people have experienced, that there have been delays in auditors getting to clients. And really it does come down to a question of resources. Now, there are things that companies could do to prepare a little bit better. Neil talked about timelines and PBC lists and how important it is. Auditors have limited resources, firms have limited resources, and have limited windows to get clients done. Companies should be working with good consultants, good firms who could help them prepare their Ks and Qs, help them get their schedules in place so that it sticks to the timeline. I mentioned earlier about more scrutiny from the PCAOB, so there's going to be more questions from auditors. Again, it's all about the timeline. If the firm says we're going to get the work done in these 3 weeks, companies should be ready in those 3 weeks, because if it goes 3 weeks in one day, it goes back to the bottom of the pile. So companies really have to take ownership of that if they want to continue to have auditors be able to audit them, again, just because there aren't enough people to do the work.
Yeah, and to add to that, somebody out here before I got up here said, hey, Levine, you've got 4,200 people. What are you worried about staffing for? And if we could hire another 1,000 people, we would. So I read an article that said 300,000 CPAs have left our audit profession. They don't want to do it anymore. They don't want to put the time in like we did for 30 or 40 years to make a career. So that's why I think you're going to see some changes. You're going to see some private equity firms come in where they could offer the young staff stock in a private equity, and they can grow that way instead of putting 40 years in as a partner and having this antiquated buyout system. But it's been extremely difficult, and you mentioned the raising of the prices, and Neil said the raising of the audit papers. It's just a very difficult profession. Most of the kids are not going into accounting. The HR people we send to the schools, very little traffic is coming to the accounting booth. So just so everybody knows, it's just going to get tougher out there as the pressure comes onto the accountants. So I'd like to throw it out to the audience. And if there's any questions, there you have 10 questions.
Thanks for the chance to ask a question. My name is Ted Kalem. I want to follow up a little on this, what happened on March 28th, because I see some non-SEC reporting shells that didn't end up with the black double diamonds. They're in this unsolicited quotes only mode. And I wasn't sure if you wanted to comment on that. And the other question I have, somewhat related, is, as a practical matter, how will because there are a lot of companies that will need to get C211s filed. As a practical matter, how are they going to get that done to get at it, whether it's the double diamonds or the unsolicited quotes? How are they going to get that thing filed?
Neil, do you want to handle that?
Sure. Well, first of all, the label and the designation is not necessarily because a company was delisted. They can actually, sorry, Joe. Oh, he raised his hand. Label and the designation is not necessarily because they were delisted. You can actually have current filings with OTC markets and be a pink current, okay? Because you're actually, but the fact that your 211 was revoked is something underneath that you wouldn't see, because for all intents and purposes, it would look like the same company. Those companies that actually didn't have current filings will then have downgraded in terms of an expert market, or they, in worst case scenario, skull and crossbones or what have you. Those are all different tiers. But there's plenty of companies that actually are current in their filings that still did earlier on lose their 211 because they weren't current before or on time. Okay. The 211 has to be filed by a broker-dealer, so no one can do that except for, and there's one here, Glendale Securities is here, they can do that. So they assess, the viability of, pushing that application through, but they have to get all the information, right? And the thing that does jump out the most in there is that regression analysis, genealogy report in that regard. So it can be done. And in the cases where it can't, and the complexity of a cap table is too great, there are some alternatives that have to get, potentially with companies completely recapitalizing, potentially spinning out into a brand new public. It's a lot of work, right? But it's also, because there's many companies there that have real businesses that need to find a pathway to move forward. So there's always a solution to everything. It just is going to be a lot of work to do so.
Joe, do you want to add something?
Yes, thank you. Hey, guys. I just want to say great job, Neil, both Neils, Corey, Stephen, thank you for your leadership in the industry. I have a question I think a lot of, at least our issuer clients and maybe some people in this room have. Can you explain to us the process of national office review or technical review? We consistently hear that our files aren't ready, can't be filed, we're not ready to go live with the transaction until our national office looks at things, our technical team. We're told it takes between 10 and 15 days to sign off on a file. How did we go from hundreds of years of accounting filings with no technical review to a 10 to 15 day delay on almost any filing across the board? And what can issuers, lawyers, bankers, other members of the deal community do to speed up that time frame? Because most times, 10 to 15 day hard calendar does not work for transactions.
So, Joe, I want to jump into that first. Thank you. So, we talked about Friedman merging into Markham, and basically when the regulators came to us, because Friedman was doing 180 million and we're number 33, they said, Levine, you're doing cannabis, you're doing cryptocurrency, you've got the largest China practice in the U.S., you need a national office. So the regulators came down to us and they said, we just think you need a national office. So what is the national office meant to me for my first filing? In the Marlton office, we're very fortunate. We kind of are a standalone Markham office. We had everything done 3 weeks ahead of time, but like you said, it took 3 weeks. We filed everything on time, but we have to show the regulators that we have superior quality control people in a special section of the firm that their only job is to beat the accountants up so we can be ready for the regulators. And Corey, you want to add to that?
Yeah. I think it's subjective and depends upon the firm that you're dealing with and the size of the company. Markham works with bigger companies. There's more people involved, and they have multiple offices. Our firm, smaller firm, we don't tend to do as big as companies. Everyone is located in the same office, and so everyone is kind of involved in the audit. So there is no, waiting until the last minute to file before the EQR, which is the quality reviewer, looks at things or approves things. So I think it's, if you're dealing with the bigger company and you're dealing with a bigger firm, that's how it's going to be. It's just too complicated. There are so many things going on that the line partner can't be an expert in everything. There are so many convoluted rules out there that you could be the smartest line partner there is, but there could be something that comes up in a complicated debt and equity transaction that only two people in the world are going to care about. Number one is the SEC reviewer, and number two is going to be the PCAOB reviewer. And you got to have somebody in your firm that sees that. So it's going to be that way, unfortunately.
Neil,
I just wanna-
I thought it was a great question.
Is that Mr. Drew Bernstein? Why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Drew Bernstein. I'm one of the co-managing partners at Markham Asia. I thought it was a great question because that comes up all the time. And I think the short answer to it is that it's going to take longer than it used to, and it shouldn't take as long as you're saying. The environment from the accounting standpoint and the regulators has really become toxic at this point. And I don't think there's a firm out there that hasn't actually had partners lose licenses over it, particularly within the SPAC market. Actually, I'd never seen investors read a financial of a SPAC, because if a SPAC is 100 million and there's 100 million in the trust account, that's all anybody cares about. I don't think anybody ever read the financials. So I think what you're seeing right now, and I'm not so sure, Corey, it's a big firm, small thing, a big firm, small firm thing. It's just that these QC partners now see, and the partners running the jobs, they actually now see their licenses at risk. It's not a slap on the hand anymore. And they're being a lot more careful. And I think you're going to start to see that also reflected in the client acceptances of a lot of these firms. That they're going to be a lot less inclined going forward to take on clients that may have issues or problems. So I go back to my original answer to your question, because I thought it was a great question. It's going to take longer than it used to. And if the firms are, good at what they did and tried to streamline the processes, and they understand your business, it shouldn't take as long as you said.
Thank you, Drew.
If you don't mind, I just want to add one more thing to what Drew just
Add
said.
away.
Thank you. So the other thing I would say is that, the companies could drive this process a little bit as well. So everything that everybody said is absolutely correct. It's going to take longer. There's more scrutiny. But companies know where their issues are, and generally they wait for the auditors to ask them questions about it. They wait for the auditors to review things. And not in every instance, just like not in every instance it takes 2 weeks to go to national. But it would really be helpful if companies drove the process a little bit, brought up those issues first, asked them to review the memo as the first thing they're doing, as opposed to getting the cash confirms together. And that's a way, the process is going to continue to get harder. There's going to be less auditors. Everybody has to pitch in a little bit to work together and improve the process, so that at the end of the day we could get the audit issued, which is what all the issuers want.
Actually, I just want to support real quickly. I've been an issuer for 20 years, and the biggest problem is not the auditor, because and to your point, it's the PCAOB, all the pressure you guys have on, and Corey, especially for firms like yours, which have been the firms I've been in, the companies don't understand the process. They wait too long to bring up the issues. And the issuer needs to be educated that the auditor is not the enemy. And the auditor's got to be the friend. There's got to be better communication. And then to the bigger firms and to the bigger processes, there's got to be better communication just to anticipate the process. But issuers just don't get it, and I'm one of them, so anyway.
Thank you. So Corey, how do we get a hold of you?
I'm in LA, Corey F at WeinbergLA.com.
Neil?
Yep. And Reithinger at EventusAG.com, Eventus AG for Eventus Advisory Group.com.
Just go to our website, pkcllp.com.
All right, guys, let's wrap it up. Anything else?
So I'm just wondering, you mentioned knowing who owns the stock as part of the audit process, the LLCs, who's really behind it. What's the awareness of the rampant naked short selling and failures to deliver that's going on? And do you ever foresee a situation where your industry might go to the regulators and bring that more to the forefront?
Well, I think that's already happening. The thing is, it's just like anything, nothing's airtight, you can't really prevent against it, and it is rampant, yes. So it's just a matter of a continuous awareness of that, and I think that scrutiny is putting more pressure on that, but it occurs. Like anything else, it's always hard to control that completely, but it is a big problem, admittedly, yeah. So, and there's constantly new regulation and or scrutiny going on with that to try to prevent it, but it's going to be impossible to stop it, I think, yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Neil Levine.
Thank you.